Military life can take soldiers to some of the most remote and eerie places in the world. And in today's video, we're diving into ghost stories from the military, real-life encounters with the supernatural that soldiers have experienced while serving. These stories are sure to leave you questioning what else lurks in the shadows of war. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future stories. I'm creating these videos to help raise funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support means everything. If you'd like to contribute, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thanks for being here, and now, let's get into these ghostly tales. Story 1. There was an airman stationed at some Basai. Don't remember which one. He was a good airman, no previous issues. He was Hispanic and very religious, and like many in that demographic, he took ghosts and spirits very seriously. Things started to change, though over a few weeks, he began showing up to work late, looking messy, out of uniform regulations, and his performance was slipping. Since he had a good track record, his supervisors gave him the benefit of the doubt at first. But as the behavior continued and got worse, they eventually had to sit him down for a talk. When they confronted him, the airman didn't say much. He just sat there, not offering any explanation for his behavior. The downward spiral continued, and soon he was getting in trouble. Letters of counseling locks, getting chewed out, to name it. Despite this, his behavior didn't improve. It got to the point where they suggested he go to mental health. He agreed and eventually went in. That's when it all came out. The airman genuinely believed his dorm room was haunted. The mental health clinic took him seriously, at least enough to recognize that he fully believed there was a ghost in his dorm. Obviously, they didn't think there was an actual ghost, so they started treating it as a mental health issue. Unfortunately, his performance continued to suffer, and it eventually reached a point where they had to move him out of his dorm and start processing him for separation from the Air Force due to psychosis and poor work performance. His supervisors didn't want to do it, but they had no choice. When the first sergeant's shirt came to the dorm to help him move out, he went into the airman's closet to grab some stuff. That's when the shirt happened to look up at the ceiling. Vent-hand, no kidding, saw a face staring back at him through the vent. The shirt freaked out, and they quickly discovered the real story. An airman who had gone AWOL was literally living in the walls of the dorm building, and he had been using this airman's room to stretch out, use the bathroom, and even just hang out. So, airman number 1 had been lying in bed at night, hearing another person crawl out of his closet, walk into the bathroom, and then disappear back into the wall. No wonder he thought his dorm was haunted, especially given his religious beliefs. After airman number 2, the ghost was removed from the base. Airman number 1's health and performance improved. He was able to stay in the Air Force after all, a happy ending. Story 2. Warehouse 1 at Kadena. A few months back when I was on swing shift, I was heading to the pilferable cage with another airman in my shop to put away some knives and other gear that needed storing. Swing shift was slow as hell, and we had a lot of bulky items, so we decided to stash everything in the cage, head to lunch, and sign it all in afterward. As we're walking up to the door, we suddenly hear footsteps scurrying behind us, coming from the corner of the warehouse, right where TMO inbound usually works. We both turn around, tracking the sound as it continues toward the dark corner of the warehouse before stopping dead. The weirdest part, the motion sensor lights didn't come on, and we saw absolutely nothing. You can bet your ass we got out of there fast and didn't go back unless we absolutely had to. Earlier that same night, our NCOIC, who's Filipino, and one of our NCOS Samoan, were swapping ghost stories from back home. During their conversation, our NCOIC suddenly heard some weird sucking and slurping noises in the office, but no one could figure out where the sounds were coming from. To top it off, another airman in the shop claimed he heard a shriek coming from inside the warehouse. After all that, for the rest of the week, Nobody went anywhere in that place without a buddy. Story 3. Here's my Kadana story. I was hanging out with a few local girls who were really into superstitions, ghosts, curses, feng shui, burning sage, the whole deal. At some point, we got talking about how my dorm room bed was perfectly positioned according to feng shui principles, hey. But then I mentioned that I usually slept on my love seat, which was perpendicular to my bed. They told me that wasn't ideal compared to my bed's position. I just shrugged it off. Growing up Catholic, I figured the best approach was to not think too much about it, either later that night or shortly after. I was asleep in my love seat when I suddenly got this overwhelming sense that someone was standing over me, watching me. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you while you're stopped at a traffic light, or when someone sneaks up behind you and you can feel their presence before you even turn around? It was just like that. My room was pitch black, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I got really scared and decided to squeeze my eyes shut as tight as possible, hoping that would make it stop. But it didn't. Eventually, I decided to face the fear head-on. So I opened my eyes and looked toward the corner where I felt like someone was standing. I shit you not, as clearly as I'm typing this out 14 years later, there was a white face in the corner of my dorm room, looking down at me. I nearly lost it. I immediately closed my eyes again as tightly as I could, yanked the blanket over my head, don't judge, and waited, ... After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to walk over to the light switch. Eyes still closed, and turned on the lights. When I opened my eyes again, thankfully there was nothing there. I think I stayed up the rest of the night with every light on, just bullshitting on my laptop and playing Modern Warfare 2 on the PS3. At least the internet bandwidth was decent, since it was the middle of the night. All these years later, that night is still the most frightened I've ever been. It's right up there in weirdness with the time I saw a man floating on the freeway, but that's a story for another day. Story 4. The story isn't really military related, but it did happen while I was on leave. I almost got carjacked in Charleston while visiting the infamous Light Road in the middle of the night. According to legend, there's this spooky orb of light that appears on the road. And people say no matter how far you drive, the light never seems to get any closer. We saw it for ourselves that night, just as everyone had described. We were driving down the road, the light hovering in the distance, but never really approaching. And then, suddenly, just as we were about to close the final distance, the light turned off. Our headlights revealed a massive dirt wall in front of us, with a yellow reflective sign that read, "Dead End." So, we turned off the road into a nearby neighborhood, one of those out in the sticks, barely any lighting at all. The only lights were coming from a couple of single wides at each end of the street. And of course, our own car. As we drove, the trailers were slowly replaced by trees, and eventually, the trees turned to black, pitch black. You couldn't see anything. The whole situation started feeling sketchy. We decided to hit a U-turn and get out of there. Just as we finished the turn, there was a man standing in the middle of the road. He was wearing all black, a black coat, black pants, and black shoes. He looked like a silhouette against the darkness. He walked up to the driver's window, and my friend, for whatever reason, decided to lower it. The man was old, with grey hair and weathered, wrinkled skin, and there were sticks and bits of debris tangled in his hair. His voice was low and almost unintelligible. We asked him to speak up, and he mumbled something about needing to charge his phone in our car. At this point, we were making excuses, trying to get out of the situation, when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was movement, fast movement, coming toward the car. My friend driving noticed it too and slammed on the gas. At this point, we were making excuses, trying to get out of the situation, when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was movement, fast movement, coming toward the car. My friend driving noticed it too and slammed on the gas. Everyone in the car was freaking out, shouting, trying to process what just happened. As we sped off, I leaned back to look out the rear window. There was a group of people gathered in the road behind us. Among them, I saw the same strange light we had been following earlier. After we finally got away, we decided to go watch a scary movie to calm our nerves. Go figure. Story 5. Army, not Air Force. But this story is one I love telling. It happened during basic training at Fort Jackson. We were the last class to go through these old barracks before they were scheduled to be torn down. These buildings were made of corrugated sheet metal and were already starting to fall apart. In fact, they had begun demo on one of the other buildings nearby. These things were definitely built before Vietnam. One night, my partner and I were on fire watch. The routine was simple. One of us had to sit at the desk while the other walked around and cleaned something. I was sitting at the desk, fighting to stay awake, when I heard someone muttering in their sleep. Not unusual, but this guy was a lot louder than usual. Out of boredom, I decided to check it out and see what he was saying. I walked over, listening closely, but I couldn't make out anything. The guy just kept mumbling under his breath. Eventually, my partner came over too, and the two of us stood there for about 5 seconds, trying to figure out what this guy was saying. Suddenly, he bolted upright, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Do you see them? They're coming." Then he collapsed back onto his bed and immediately started snoring like nothing had happened. We looked at each other, completely freaked out, but neither of us said a word about it. It was a weird moment, but nothing that seemed ghost-worthy at the time. That is, until the next morning. When we all woke up, everyone in the bay noticed that their beds had been moved 2 inches away from the walls. Every single bed. To this day, I can't explain how that happened. I've seen some strange stuff in my life, but this is the one thing that I still can't come up with a reasonable explanation for. Story 6. I don't know if anyone else agrees, but Incirlik AB in Turkey has a spiritual darkness hanging over it. While I was at the base hotel during COVID quarantine, I had an intense experience with what felt like a very negative presence. The room occasionally reeked of methane, but I couldn't find any source for the smell. Then, about 3 days before I was set to be released, I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling cold. As I reached for the blanket I'd left on the chair next to the bed, I suddenly felt a malicious stare, as if someone was watching me from the corner of the room, ready to charge like a linebacker. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was locked in place, staring at what I knew was an unseen figure. The day I was finally released from quarantine, I came down with the worst cold of my life. This was before COVID hit me later on. I had other strange experiences at Incirlik, but this one was by far the most intense. Something similar happened when I stayed at Hill AFB's hotel as well, though not quite as bad. I was staying in a suite, and the gas stove turned itself on while I wasn't even near it, clicked, and turned all the way to medium heat. I hadn't touched it the entire time I was there. Throughout my stay, I kept catching glimpses of darting shadows out of the corners of my eyes. The strangest part was the dreams. Several times, I dreamed I was fighting off this pale, golem-like creature from the bedroom as it tried to force its way inside. Story 7. It was 3 a.m., and I was opening the Yokota passenger terminal with my supervisor and another airman for an early spacer flight. My task was to turn on the lights and the TVs that broadcast information around the terminal. I headed over to the inbound passenger side, which was still dark except for a few backup lights. The breaker box I needed to reach was all the way across the room, so I started walking over when I suddenly heard heavy footsteps running up behind me. Thinking it was my supervisor or the other airman rushing over to tell me something important, I turned around, but no one was there. The room was empty. I quickly flipped the lights on at the breaker and made my way back to dispatch. where I found my supervisor and the other airmen deep in conversation about work, nowhere near where I had been. Another time, I was working nights at the terminal and getting ready to shut down and lock up the building. Part of the routine is checking the bathrooms to make sure no passengers are hiding, hoping for a free place to sleep for the night. I walked into the female bathroom and, in the reflection of the mirror, I saw a solid black, humanoid shape standing in one of the stalls. I quickly turned around to check, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Needless to say, I didn't stick around to check the rest of the stalls. During night shifts, we all heard strange things: phantom footsteps, doors flying open, and an overwhelming sense of unease. The weirdest part was that we could never explain the noises. The terminal would be locked up tight, and we'd all be in the same room, but every now and then, someone would swear they heard someone walking or running down the halls. Story 8. While stationed in Okinawa, my friends and I frequently explored a couple of the local abandoned sites: the derelict hotel near Kadena and the old club near Naha. Even though these places had a reputation for being creepy, we never really experienced anything out of the ordinary while we were inside them. The club office, though, definitely had an eerie vibe. Old paperwork and files were scattered everywhere, giving the place a haunting feel. The only unexplainable things I ever encountered happened on the flight line in the passes. Every now and then, we'd hear the doors making strange noises, even when there was no wind. Sometimes, we even heard what sounded like whispering coming from behind the rear doors, but no one could ever explain where it came from. Despite our love for paranormal exploration, we always made sure to be respectful wherever we went, hoping to avoid stirring up anything we couldn't handle. However, there was one place we refused to explore at night: Maida Escarpment, also known as Hacksaw Ridge. Too many stories circulated about people randomly falling into the ocean at night, and we weren't about to take any chances. Story 9. I have one ghost story and one UFO story. Ghost story: Kadena housing. While we were living in Kadena housing, my wife and I had a strange experience one night. We woke up to the sound of something falling outside our bedroom. Naturally, we thought it was one of our cats knocking something over, but when we checked, both of them were asleep on their cat tree. I got up to investigate, and that's when we both saw a dark figure standing in the hallway. We blinked a few times, and just like that, it was gone. We checked earthquake info to see if there had been any tremors that could have caused the noise, but there were none. Normally, I'd chalk up seeing something to a post-dream hallucination, but the fact that we both saw it made it undeniable. There were other strange occurrences while we lived there, but that one really stuck with us. The moment we realized something was living in our house with us. UFO story: Osan Air Base. One night at Osan, my wife and I were outside smoking. It was a rare, cloudless night in Korea, and we were admiring the stars. Suddenly, we noticed a few stars being eclipsed by something passing overhead. It was far enough away that we couldn't hear anything, but we could see the stars briefly disappear one by one. We could barely make out a shape, something that resembled a large, symmetrical boomerang. It didn't have any lights, and we could only discern its shape by the stars it blocked out. We watched it for a few minutes until it disappeared out of sight. The next day, I was at work, a job where we track all aircraft flying in the area by radar and IFF 24/7s. I decided to check the records, pulling up a radar feed from the time I had noted the sighting. I watched closely, hoping to see something that would explain what we saw. But oddly, nothing came within 30 miles of the base during that time. It's a memory that still leaves me wondering what it was we saw that night. Story 10. Before I joined the Guard, I spent some time wintering over at the South Pole Station in the mid-2000s. Our crew was small, about 50 people in total, and I was the station engineer. When you're stuck with a group that small for 9 months, sometimes even longer, You get to know everyone really well. You can tell who someone is just by the way they wear their clothes, how they walk, and you start to recognize their patterns, where they are, when they're there, and so on. My office was in the power plant, and one day, I was walking out to the Rodwell or water well. It was dark, always dark in the winter round. The temperature was in the -80 degrees Fahrenheit range. The best way to navigate in that kind of environment is to turn off your light. Let your eyes adjust, and try not to trip over anything. As I was walking, I heard the clunk of an emergency exit hatch opening, followed by the sound of someone climbing out. I looked up and saw someone walking toward the RF facility, which was about half a mile away, then heading off the station altogether. At that time, there were only 4 people who it could have been. 2 women and 2 guys. From the figure, I could tell it was definitely a man, but not Fat Bob, who was one of the guys. I called out to the figure, but got no reply. That wasn't unusual, though out there, sound can travel strangely, and with the wind, hearing can be really directional. Still, I didn't recognize the person and didn't think much of it at the time. I checked on the boiler at the Rodwell, then headed back to the galley to grab some coffee. To my surprise, the one person I thought it could have been was sitting in the galley, and he wasn't supposed to be on rounds that night. I checked with a few others, radioed out to the RF facility, but no one had been out there. I'm not sure if it was a ghost story, but it was definitely a weird, freaky mystery that still sticks with me nearly 20 years later. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey through military ghost stories. If these tales gave you chills, make sure to like and subscribe, and share this video with anyone who enjoys a good ghost story. Your support not only helps me create more content, but it also helps raise funds for my dad's medical treatment if you can. Please check out the GoFundMe link in the description below. I'd love to hear from you. If you or someone you know has experienced anything paranormal, especially in the military, drop it in the comments. Who knows, it could be featured in a future video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.